Bismillah wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome to our viewers to our event today, which is the final installment in a series of events that we've been hosting here at the Lewisham Islamic Center as part of Islamophobia Awareness Month. In the first week, we had an event with looking at and concentrated about the role of politics in media. The second week, we had a look at the role of the war on terror and the link to Islamophobia. Last week, we had an activist, Brother Ghulam Haider from Manchester, who joined us to speak about the role of activists and what they can do in challenging Islamophobia. And today, we're looking at the role of the media in relation to Islamophobia. With us today, we've got two respectable guests with us today. We've got Roshan Salih, who's a journalist and has worked for a number of British mainstream media outlets, including ITV, Channel 4, the Discovery Channel, amongst others. He's also worked for a number of other Muslim stations as well, including Islam Channel, Press TV, Al Jazeera as well. And he's been in journalism for the past 20 years. He also runs what I understand is to be the number1 Muslim news site here in the UK, 5 Pillars, which has been going strong since 2013, which he co-hosts and also founded with Dili Hussain. We also have with us Brother Salman Butt, who's the chief editor of Islam 21C, which has been going on for about 8 years now, I understand it to be. Salman is someone who I understand has a PhD in photosynthesis, so it will be interesting to see how we went from that to becoming a chief editor of Islam 21C. So I think it would be good to begin to find out from our guests a bit more about themselves and the institutions that they themselves represent. So if I could start with Roshan, please, if you could explain to us, please, a bit about yourself, tell us a bit about yourself, your role into journalism, and about 5 Pillars.
Assalamu alaikum, Zilla. Assalamu alaikum, Salman. Yeah, so I've been a journalist for about 22 years now, I think, very long time. And I guess I got into it simply because I wanted to have a fulfilling career. You know, we spend so much time at work that I wanted to do something interesting. You know, if I'm going to spend those 8 hours a day at work, I wanted to have fun doing it and be fulfilled doing it. And I love to read and write. So I guess that's how I got into it. I was a teacher for a couple of years, kind of fell into teaching, was a bit lazy, but eventually gravitated towards what I really wanted to do, and that was journalism. And, you know, I've been a journalist for 22 years and I've had a great experience overall. You know, worked in the mainstream media, worked in the, you know, kind of alternative media. I've been able to travel the world, and I think I've reported from about 25 different countries, covered war zones like in Iraq and Gaza, Libya, Lebanon, elsewhere, and met lots of interesting people. And also I've done more kind of soft stuff, like, you know, cover major sporting events like the Olympics and the World Cup. And I've done a lot of boring things as well, apart from those glamorous things. But, you know, I think that overall I've had a really fulfilling career. And I think that most Muslim journalists especially, they think they've made it when they've, you know, got a plum job at the BBC or ITV, and I've never thought that way. I always wanted to use the mainstream as a training so that I could go into Muslim media. I didn't use Muslim media to go as a training to go into the mainstream, which is what most people do. And alhamdulillah, I think I'm really lucky, because now, after all those years slaving away at different media organizations, we launched 5 Pillars in 2013, and now that is effectively my full-time job. And it's so fulfilling. I get to choose the stories that I want to cover. I get to represent Muslims in, you know, be in the driving seat and represent Muslims in a way that I couldn't even when I was working in the Muslim media, because you've always got somebody above you telling you what to do and what the editorial line should be. So we launched 5 Pillars about 7 years ago as a labor of love. Both Dili and myself were in full-time jobs, and we were doing it as a part-time job. And, you know, we really felt that, I guess, if I'm honest, we felt that not only did the mainstream media not reflect Muslims and give Muslims a proper voice, but even the Muslim media, to a certain extent, didn't do that, because they just weren't professional enough. They weren't perhaps even provocative enough. They didn't have the journalistic skills to do that. And that's why we launched 5 Pillars. And I think we wanted to keep it independent from day one. We didn't want to be, basically beholden to a state or a sectarian group here, there, and everywhere. We wanted to represent all Muslims, and we wanted to be able to write, and say what we wanted to. And that's a conscious decision that we've taken from day one, not to take lots of money from a certain vested interest. So, and we would have to effectively peddle their line. So, alhamdulillah, in the early days, we doubted that strategy because we were so poor. But alhamdulillah, 7 years later, we're sustainable now. I think it's proven to be a wise strategy. We're both journalists, both Dilly and myself are qualified journalists and experienced journalists. We regulated 5 Pillars as well. We have an independent regulator called Impress, which has the power to sanction us. And we felt that that was a very kind of necessary move because we wanted to give our readers the confidence that actually what we were writing wasn't made up, by mavericks or whatever. It was quality journalism, credible journalism. They could complain about our journalism. We would make corrections, etc., etc. So it's been a long road from the very early days when we were a very small website without many readers, without many followers. We're still not where we want to be, but ultimately we do reach millions of people every month now through our website and through our social media pages. We're still basically a 2-man team though, Dilly and myself, and obviously we work with freelancers for all the technical stuff and the editorial stuff. But we're certainly not at the end of our journey. We see ourselves, perhaps 20% along the road.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We'll come back to some of those points as we go through the discussion during the course of today's event. Brother Salman, if you could give us a bit of background about yourself, maybe you can also let us know what made you go from photosynthesis to, I know photosynthesis is about light, but you went from absorbing the light and then
emitting it, yeah,
it on into the media light. So if you could let us know, what brought that about.
Yeah, Bismillah, alhamdulillah, Jazakallah khair for the hosting this event, mashallah. So my personal background is, I was studying biochemistry and doing research into, like I said, photosynthesis and chemical biology. Islam 21C, actually, I didn't found it. It was started in 2006. I just joined about 7-8 years ago after I finished my PhD, and I wanted to apply some of the transferable skills from research. PhD is, in a nutshell, is just a license to supervise independent research. So whatever you apply that to, the point of a PhD is to get those research skills and so forth. So I wanted to apply that to something in the community itself, rather than just because to succeed in a career in research, you have to give it your all, and all your spare time and everything has to be to do with that in order to excel in that. And mashallah, there's a lot of good and capable Muslim researchers. But while I was at university, I got more and more interested in Islamic community affairs and Muslim activism and so forth. So early on, Islam 21C was more, perhaps if you might remember, it was maybe a bit more academic, more. It's never been a journalistic kind of a news site per se, but it started off as being about articulating Islam in the 21st century. And over the years, our vision has kind of crystallized into seeing every Muslim confident and impacting the world. So part of that involves giving Muslims tools, encouraging them to, in whatever sense possible, build, nurture confidence and create impact wherever they can in their lives. And part of that is, being aware, being cognizant of what's going on around the world. So we do news views, which are kind of views on the news, and we get journalists to write for Islam 21C. But it's always been a means to an end. It's a means to Muslims feeling confident in their skin as Muslims, developing that Islamic identity, and trying to be as impactful as possible. So finding all those impact opportunities. Like we launched a campaign recently alongside many other organizations, including 5 Pillars, alhamdulillah. So yeah, I wanted to put more effort into nurturing the Islamic confidence of our community, basically. So that's where we're at with the Psalm 21C. It's not a one-man show. I'm just a pretty face who takes the credit for everything. All the hard work is done behind the scenes. With, a large and growing team, alhamdulillah, about 15, 16 people. So yeah.
Excellent. Have you written an article on photosynthesis yet then?
I have for academic journals, but they're too boring to cite here or get anyone to read.
Yeah. Okay. Well, sort of coming back to the topic of discussion for today, I mean, we all know that the media more often than not helps to craft and shape public opinion. And that being the case, my propositional question to both of you is, do you feel that the mainstream media is Islamophobic? Roshan, if I could ask you to begin.
Well, my personal experience is that it definitely was, because I worked in the mainstream media and I had lots of I mean, it wasn't, my everyday existence wasn't an Islamophobic nightmare, but in just terms of the stories that we had to tell and how they were crafted, ultimately they were antithetical towards Muslims. A lot of them were anyway. I remember working on a show on Palestine when I was at London Weekend Television, and it was about the Palestinian perspective. It's actually shot in Palestine. And the producer refused to interview somebody from Hamas. And I said, look, Hamas is probably about 30% of the public opinion in Palestine. Then we have Fatah, which is another 30, 40%. And then we have others, minorities. So we have to interview everybody. But the feeling was that, no, we couldn't give Hamas a voice because they're terrorists. This was back in, 2003 or something like that, before they were actually designated a terrorist group by certain Western states. I remember working in the run-up to the Iraq War, and I was basically forced to work on a program which made the case for the war. And that was one of the most shameful things I ever did. I thought, I've got to get out now. I didn't have a choice. It was like, I make the program or I lose my job, effectively. So these are the kind of pressures that you're constantly under.
Just to interject, Roshan. So when was this roughly in terms of year we're talking?
2003, I think it was 2002, 2003. So yeah.
And just for the benefit of our listeners, I mean, as I understand it, Hamas isn't a prescribed group here in the UK. I believe the military wing, Al-Qassam,
yes,
are, but Hamas isn't. Hamas is a political party there as well, as you said, part of the reality there. But I suppose more to the point is, if, for example, mainstream media outlets or a news channel were covering a story about Ireland, for example, if we're going back to the 90s or even the 80s, let's say, or before that, and the troubles there, and we've even seen it even more recently, there's been no issues in interviewing someone from the IRA, for example.
Yeah, I mean, look, Zilla, ultimately, all media, or virtually all media, is propaganda. And the BBC is propaganda as well. And so is The Guardian. So it's just different elements of subtlety in the propaganda. So you have, let's say, for example, Russia Today, RT. It's obvious pro-Russian propaganda. There's no doubt about that. Everyone can see that. But they don't really pretend to be anything otherwise. They say they're a Russian station and they're presenting the Russian point of view. So in a way, you can kind of respect that. Whereas the BBC and others, they actually say, no, we're impartial. And that is not the case. It's just simply not the case. And it's been proved through studies many, many times. In terms of, in the run-up to the Iraq War, for example, something like 70% of the news stories were skewed towards a pro-war position. And there are many, many more examples. So I think that basically the BBC and others are lying to you. Whereas the more, Fox News, Russia Today, and all the other state channels around the world, in a way, at least they're being honest, because they say they're a, I don't know, Russian TV station, American TV station, French TV station, whatever. So yeah, all media is propaganda. In terms of Islamophobia, I think the NCB did a report last year, which said that most coverage of Muslims in British news outlets has a negative slant. that contributes towards Islamophobia. The Mail on Sunday, I think, is the worst, the most egregious kind of culprit when it comes to that. But newspapers like the Telegraph and the Times don't lag too far behind. And I think the MC report, off the top of my head, it was like 59% of stories about Muslims in the British mainstream media are skewed against Muslims. And we also shouldn't fall into the trap into thinking that it's just the right-wing media, the usual suspects like the Murdoch media. No, the left-wing media is Islamophobic as well. The Guardian, the Independent. I mean, I remember there were several years when the Guardian, when the Independent spiritual advisor was Majid Nawaz. You know, I'm obviously exaggerating a little bit, but literally they would go to him for every single comment on a news story. They're not as blatantly Islamophobic as the right-wing media, but they're still part of this Islamophobic media culture that we live in, unfortunately.
It's indiscriminate, irrespective if it's from the left or the right. You're saying it's a problem across the spectrum. Salman, if we could get your take and view on that, be appreciated.
Yeah, I mean, the mainstream media is Islamophobic because the broader atmosphere it's operating in is Islamophobic. And it's important to differentiate between the personal, individual examples of racism or bigotry or Islamophobia or whatever, and the actual structures in place, the actual norms, the inherited kind of discourse from hundreds of years ago. So the way in which Islam as a bogeyman, whether it's Islam today or Islamism or Mohammedans or even Moors, Moriscos or whatever, wherever Muslims, if you're talking in the Indian subcontinent, they've always been a convenient kind of placeholder to project kind of insecurities, to define the border between the civilized world, the West, and the Orient, the other. You know, so as a result of that, there's the impulses that have existed in broader society for hundreds of years still permeate the discourse in mainstream media today. So, like Roshan mentioned, right-wing media operates more often than not on the kind of colonial impulse, for example, to dominate, to vilify and so forth, whereas maybe the left-wing media doesn't do that so much, but it still is governed by in a lot of its discourse the impulse to civilize, another colonial impulse, right? The twin impulses to dominate and to civilize, to construct, to change Islam and Muslims to fit into their ideals, and this is based on a projection that Islam and Muslims are XYZ, the different stereotypes and myths and so forth that have lingered from hundreds of years. So the Islamophobia, it does exist in various flavors and impulses and stuff. Jonathan Lyons, for example, has a very good tracing of the discourse of Islam through Western eyes. It's called Islam through Western eyes. So from the Crusades all the way to the War on Terror, and he finds these different, common motifs and common occurrences, and with which Islam is described, as the bogeyman in order to, rally up the troops or to unite Europe, or to give it a sense of self, and so yes, I would say we have to address both the interpersonal thing when that kind of trickles down to the individual, person being rude to their neighbor or attacking someone, all the way up to the policy, the language, the norms with which we kind of make policy and so forth.
Yeah. Okay. No, Jazakallah khair. Roshan, did you have something to add? Sorry.
Yeah, I think it's very important when we talk about the mainstream media. The instinct of the mainstream media, when they're confronted with stats like 0.8% of the Muslims in this country are journalists, which is something like 5% of the population or more than that is actually Muslim, and the wider ethnic minority stats, which prove that these organizations don't have enough ethnic minorities and Muslims in there. Their response is tokenism. So what they'll do is they'll get a Muslim, a brown face, and they'll put them on the 9 o'clock news, the 10 o'clock news. And they say, all right, we've got the problem solved. But in reality, the decision makers are still white, middle-aged men, by and large. The researchers, the producers, etc.
Because obviously, more recently, in the last week or so, we've had some guidance from the Independent Press Complaints Commission, IPSO, published some guidance, and I'll get your thoughts on that. Just going back slightly, Roshan, and you mentioned about your experiences in mainstream media, and you said you felt it was Islamophobic. Then you gave an example of that. I've heard some experiences of other Muslim journalists like yourself, and who've also worked in mainstream media, and they found that they were invariably being asked to cover stories relating to terrorism or extremism or issues like that. Did you have a similar experience?
I was used, when I was working at Granada, I was used as bait. We were doing
How long ago was Roshan, Granada? Yeah, that was some of our viewers won't remember.
Yeah, this was 2002, I think. LWT, London Weekend Television, and Granada are the same company, basically. So I use the terms interchangeably. We were doing a story about dodgy food in restaurants, believe it or not, and they made me, basically. I mean, when I say they made me, obviously it's my fault. Ultimately, I played along, and we targeted some halal meat shops, which obviously had dodgy meat, basically. And again, they said, oh, he's the Muslim. Get him to do some undercover work, expose these guys selling dodgy meat. And I felt very uncomfortable doing it, but I did do it, you know, and may Allah forgive me. But I did it. So those are the kind of things that you feel that you have to do it. Otherwise, you're not going to get a promotion. You're not going to get ahead. You're going to get sacked. They have you on very short-term contracts, let's say 3-month contracts. So you're kind of pressured into doing this kind of stuff. I remember Asad Beg, for example, when he was, I think, a reporter for Channel 4 News. I mean, he was constantly in the right-wing media for stuff on his Facebook page and this and that. And ultimately, as a Muslim journalist in the mainstream, you're held to a higher standard than non-Muslim journalists. And ultimately, we're all members of the society. We should all be treated equally. And that's all that Muslims are asking for in this country.
No, absolutely. Salman, have you heard of any experiences similar to that about Muslim journalists being asked to earn their stripes, as it were, to cover stories?
Yeah, I mean, I remember the similar thing. You know, ironically, is one of the Muslim journalists now that is kind of fighting this, you know, against Islamophobic journalists, but themselves they were, you know, part of, I won't mention their names, but part of these kind of undercover sting operations on Sharia councils, you know, that kind of stuff. So pushing these false narratives that there's some kind of, you know, takeover plot to, you know, replace British law or whatever, or these things are operating a parallel judicial system, which is completely false. I mean, Sharia courts operate completely within the existing kind of legislation. So these types of things. So I don't know whether internally, and can't see, you know, what's in their hearts and stuff about where they genuinely convinced about this stuff, or were they just kind of trying to build a name for themselves by attacking their own. I mean, this is unfortunately a common, an ancient kind of, you know, archetype, right? Like Qarun, and in the story of Musa alayhi salam, he was from Banu Israel, but he transgressed and betrayed his own people and enriched himself in the process, right? And, you know, Malcolm X talked about the whole, the house slave and the field slave. And, you know, so there's always that, there's no shortage of brown faces that can be co-opted to push narratives and push stories that demonize the whole kind of community, you know. So
yeah,
but it's not just the Muslims as well. It's even kind of, I remember the that non-Muslim guy who resigned from the Daily Star, was it? I forgot his name, but just people who act out of principle because the editors clearly want them to spin something out of nothing that kind of demonizes Muslims, or you know, that kind of stuff. So we need, I mean, Roshan mentioned 0.8 or 0.7% of journalists are Muslim, for example. So that representation is important, but the representation of ideas and values and interests and ethics, that can be done with even non-Muslim journalists. And yeah, I mean, I know we want to discuss about Muslims going into journalism, and I think it's a good idea that more Muslims there are. But it's a means to an end, it's a means to get their interests of the whole community, and just the interests of truth and accuracy and fairness more represented there.
And I think Roshan mentioned about Muslims being held to a higher standard, or Muslim journalists being held to a higher standard. But I think that cuts across the Muslim community generally. And if we talk about sort of current events, something that's happened recently, this week, for example, the passing away of which I feel, the greatest football player, Maradona, for example. And, you've seen the eulogies, lots of people, speaking about, how great he was and what a loss to football, and, how he himself was a victim of his own success, and, how many people used him and exploited him and so on and so forth. But if you look at that, so for example, people focusing on his positive aspects, you've got lots of people commenting, that they think, he played such an integral part in the field of football and so on. But of course, we all know, and it has to be acknowledged, that Maradona did a lot of unsavory things as well. But what you often find with the Muslim community is that if it were Muslim, or the Muslim community was speaking about someone in this way, and they were speaking about the passing away of a Muslim figure, let's say, they'll automatically be associated with all the other negative things that person may have been involved with, or their views on certain things, even if they themselves don't subscribe to that or condone it in any way. Do you see that as well?
Yeah, the kind of guilt by association, and I mean that's what.
So are we going to say all those people?
That's all they have.
So are we going to say Gary Lineker, for example, is an apologist for some of the actions, sort of taking drugs, for example, or shooting at journalists, or some of the other things that Maradona has done in his life? It would be ridiculous and stupid to say so, but equally, it's ridiculous and stupid to then associate Muslims with everything that someone else may have done.
I mean, that's all they have. That's all kind of more mainstream, kind of the more active Islamophobes. That's all they have. They sit on Twitter or whatever. Kind of trying to make these connections and this guilt by association. But I think that's a good example. Bring examples like this, and maybe doing a parallel to highlight how absurd that is would be a good article.
Roshan, do you agree?
I remember always, I think it was after one of the terror attacks in London, maybe the London Bridge attack, I was caught, this is a true story, by the way. I'm not making this up. I was called by a Sun journalist and asked when I personally was going to condemn the attack, and when 5 Pillars was going to condemn the attack. I mean, I had nothing to do with it. I wasn't there. I didn't know anybody, but yet there was this expectation that, I think it was because the MCB were condemning it, and, lots of other groups were condemning it, that all Muslims should condemn it. And my policy was that, all right, it's terrible. It's murder, it's terrorism, but I had nothing to do with it. So why should I automatically, just because I'm a Muslim, be associated with it?
Yeah. I mean, that's a bit ridiculous. It's like someone, calling out Jonathan Dimbleby or someone else just because of an attack that's taken place.
Is that your one white kind of person in your mind that you go to?
Brendan Tarrant, for example, carries out his mass killing in New Zealand, and you call out Dimbleby and say, "Oh, do you condone this?" I mean, it's just quite frankly, it's absurd. But not just you, but they was also asking for 5 Pillars to also do so, which is.
I think the mainstream ultimately sees the Muslim community through the lens of counterterrorism, and the stories we're not ordinary people. We're either potential extremists or potential terrorists. I don't know, but the amount of stories that have some kind of a link with what Muslim women wear, or with extremism and terrorism, even if they aren't directly associating an individual with those things, that is how the wider community or the mainstream media sees us, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But the reality is that most Muslims are like everyone else. We're quite boring, you know, and we lead quite boring lives. But you know, if you look at the mainstream media, we're up to no good most of the time, or we're thinking about it at least, or tacitly supporting it.
Reminds me of this good book.
I haven't read that yet. I must do.
Yeah. It's on my list. I was sent it a few weeks ago, but I think it's out now anyway. It says advanced reading copy. Oops. But yeah, it's really you know, I've seen a few of the essays in it before anyway, but it's along that.
Yeah, no, we had Dr. Asim on 2 weeks ago, and he spoke about the book. I mean, I've read parts of it, and the opening part's really powerful. And I've read Dr. Tariq Yunus's part, which I thought was excellent. So yeah, I definitely recommend it, and fits into what we were discussing here about Roshan being asked to condemn. And the book here is called "I Refuse to Condemn." Just looking at some of some headlines in some of the stories that we've seen over the years. I mean, I remember there was one some years ago about Muslims plotting to kill the Pope. I mean, it's completely made up, of course. There's one here by the Daily Star called "BBC Puts Muslims Before You." There's another one in the Sun called "Halal Secret of Pizza Express," which you may remember. There's one by the Daily Mail: "Muslim vote could decide 25% of the seats." There's one by the Mail Online by Katie Hopkins, who falsely linked a family, the Mahmoud family, to extremism. I understand they successfully sued her. That's great news. The Sun, the print media, they wrongly reported that 1 in 5 British Muslims had sympathy with jihadis. The Sun, again online, falsely reported that there was an act of terror as a gunman screamed "Allahu Akbar" and opened fire in a Spanish supermarket, when in fact the individual named Stefan spoke Basque and had psychological problems and did not open fire, nor did he scream "Allahu Akbar" as well. I mean, these are just a few, you know, articles, sort of headline articles that we've seen. But of course, we know there's hundreds of these on a regular basis. I mean, have you seen these headlines and these types of stories increasing over the years, Roshan?
I'm not sure whether they've increased or not, but
what do you think the purpose is of these types of sort of loaded headlines?
I think what people need to understand, Zillow, is that this is not happening by accident. It's not just a few rotten apples, a few wild, crazy editors. This is a project. Islamophobia is a project in the media. And I think that ultimately what's happened in Britain over the last 20 years is that the government, the authorities, the financial institutions, the establishment, if you want to call it that, they failed ordinary people, you know? And so to assuage some of the anger that, let's say, white working class Britons feel, who've had their livelihoods eroded over the last 20 years, etc., they need to find a scapegoat. So you have the white working class in this country, to a large extent, blaming Muslims for all their ills, when it's not Muslims to blame. It's the politicians, it's the financial institutions, it's the people who really control the country, not a weak minority. Tony Blair, for example, he launched that war of choice in 2003, not a war of necessity, a war of choice in 2003 on Iraq. Okay, before that, I'm not saying it was all hunky-dory. There are many problems of racism. I mean, I grew up in the 80s and the 90s, so I experienced some of that. I know what it was like, and I don't have rose-tinted spectacles. But something happened post-2003, because ultimately, Tony Blair took the choice to launch that bloody, murderous war, that genocidal war, and that did radicalize a whole generation of Muslims, and also non-Muslims in this country, as we saw with the Corbyn movement later on. And in order to basically wash his hands of all the guilt for what he'd done, he decided to launch a project which would blame Muslims for terrorism, you know, and would put everything on, not talk about foreign policy, but only focus on the role of Muslims in stopping extremism and terrorism. It's a project, and it's a project ultimately born out of the failures of those who lead us, and intended to basically wash their hands of guilt and place it on a weak minority, namely Muslims.
Yeah, I mean, you'd think the way the media writes about the Muslim community or speaks out the Muslim community, you'd think we a real sizable, we have a real sizable presence here in the UK, and that we're controlling these institutions, and we're so powerful. But of course, it's anything but that. And I think our percentage, I think 2011 census was about 5%. It'd be interesting to see next year, which is going to be 10 years when the next census comes out, where we are with that, inshallah.
But one thing, if I can just interject quickly, Zilla, one thing that is interesting is that Muslims do have a large presence in London. You know, 1 in 9 Londoners is a Muslim. So it's like 1 million Muslims in London out of a population of about 9 million, something like that. What is the main London-based radio station? LBC, okay? They are literally the biggest radio station. They're nationwide now, but they're based in London and they serve London mainly, okay? 19 out of their 20 presenters is white. They have 1 brown presenter. Who's that? Someone who spends most of his time.
I'd rather not mention his name. I refuse to mention.
But you see what I mean? There's no where's the representation in a city which is multicultural, which is 1/9 Muslim, which is left-leaning, which is mainly Labour supporting, and we have this right-wing radio station which basically represents middle-class white men.
Isn't it? Isn't that the case though with any privately owned organization? You know, it's if whoever's trendsetter is gets to play with it however he or she wishes, right?
But sort of going back, I mean, reading some of those headlines that I read out, so I'm just going to go back slightly. So let's replace the term Muslim in some of these and replace it with another community, let's say. So let's say the story by the Daily Star, which said BBC puts Muslims before you. Imagine if that had read BBC puts Jews before you, you know, or kosher secret of Pizza Express, or Jewish vote could decide 25% of the seats, or, you know, 1 in 5 British Jews had sympathy for Israel, let's say, for example, or that, you know, a Jewish family linked to extremism, or whatever it may be. So, I mean, can you see how just by replacing the word Muslim and changing it to another community, another minority community, that automatically it would be seen or viewed probably to be more severe than what we see with the Muslim community. And sort of probably a good point to bring in this new guidance that was published by Ipso recently this week, which is effectively guidance on about, you know, how media can better present articles or stories about Islam and Muslims. And so I'm just going to find my notes here. And I think whilst they do a good job in the guidance, I don't know if you've read the guidance. I think Roshan, you may have, because I know 5 Pillars did a piece on it. But, you know, having read the guidance, I mean, I think they do a good job at the outset explaining what Islam is. I mean, you might have a different view, just basic, as a basic guidance. I think, you know, they've set out what the 5 pillars, mind the pun. Salman could probably use one of his sound effects that he often uses. I think they did a good job explaining what the 5 pillars are, what the articles of faith are, for example, and things like that. But apart from that, it doesn't really do anything. I mean, to me, I know 5 pillars have criticized it. I know other groups such as Hacked Off have also criticized it as well. But to me, it seems to be what they're effectively saying. I mean, the fact that they've produced this guidance, and this guidance has been in the making actually for some years, they've actually delayed in presenting it. It's meant to have come out a number of years ago. There was a stop to it. I think someone from the inside had sent out some guidance, leaked it to Policy Exchange. Policy Exchange had written an article about it, and I think they then went into hiding for some time, and it's now suddenly come out. But it's obviously been watered down, it seems, and effectively all it's really saying is you can continue to write whatever stories you want about the Muslim community, so long as it's accurate, so long as you're not discriminating an individual, for example, that you can even make prejudicial, pejorative references to the religion itself, and that's free speech and so on. But surely they have more of a duty and obligation to protect this community. I think going back with the fact that they produce the guidance means that they acknowledge and they understand that there is a problem, but they've failed to do anything about it. What's your thoughts on that, Roshan?
It was a whitewash. That's my thoughts. What people need to understand is that the TV news in this country is regulated by Ofcom. So they have to abide by a certain standard. So they can't get away with the most egregious examples of Islamophobia because they would perhaps be sanctioned for it. The press is not regulated. It's self-regulated to a large degree. And that's why you see the worst forms of Islamophobia and hate speech in the print media. Now, IPSO is a body which regulates the mainstream, the big mass circulation newspapers like The Sun, the Daily Mail, etc., etc. But what you need to understand about IPSO is that it is paid for by the newspapers themselves.
Yeah.
That's where it gets its funding. It is not independent. It ultimately is beholden to the people that pay the money, like any organization is, if we're frank. You just have to follow the money trail to know who's really calling the shots. And this guidance, unfortunately, it wasn't the sexiest of stories. So Muslims, by and large, didn't pay much attention to it, but it was an extremely important story because apart from the state itself, the media is probably the second most important, significant source of Islamophobia in this country. And what IPSO have given the main mass circulation newspapers to do is a green light, effectively, to continue criticizing Muslims by this pathetic set of guidelines. And it's very instructive. And my final point on this is if you look at the examples of complaints that they have turned down, for example, Fatima Manji, the hijabi Channel 4 news presenter, on the day that the Nice attack happened, she presented Channel 4 News. Kelvin Mackenzie, right-wing commentator in The Sun, wrote that it was outrageous that a woman in hijab should present Channel 4 News on the day of an attack in Nice, even though she obviously had nothing to do with it whatsoever. I think 1,000 people, Muslims and non-Muslims, complained about that, saying it was outrageous discrimination. IPSO said it was fair comment. So we know what to expect from the mainstream media.
Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, Zilli, the example that you mentioned about, changing the example to mention Jews, for example, or someone else. I mean, a journalist told me one of the reasons why Muslims are such fair game is because we don't complain as much. And Muslims need to wake up, and we have a duty to do as well, not to kind of just let the racists and Islamophobes off the hook, but we have to do our part as well. When we and from one angle, it's good. Muslims are very, very unlikely to feel victimized, and they just take it on the chin and then carry on and don't complain about stuff. But that's very bad when you're trying to exert some kind of pressure and force to change, right? So while we don't take it internally in our hearts and feel victimized, if something does happen, like Mend was once mentioning that, the imams get attacked and their eyes gets gouged and whatever, but they don't complain, they don't report it. But when somebody else, maybe somebody looks at them funny, they report it as a hate crime. Not to say that we go to that extent, but when something does happen, when you witness something, you need to report it. You need to complain, write a letter to the editor, Ofcom, complain to BBC or whatever, because that's how, number one, we get statistics on a national level that the scale, understanding the scale of the problem. And number two, many BBC kind of headlines, for example, get overturned just by 5, 6, 7 people complaining. And although it is a norm, as Saeed Awarsi said, Islamophobia is past the dinner table test, 10 years ago, whatever. Although it is a norm, we need to understand that it's not like the tentacles of some kind of a monster that's compelling every journalist and every editor to do what they're doing. It's a filtration mechanism. So people will get into certain positions of influence and power and so forth if they already have views that are within the window of expressible opinion, for example, in those important kind of positions. It's not the fact that there's some, you know, secret board meeting somewhere saying, right now we're gonna, you know, publish these Islamophobic things over the next 12 months or whatever. So when Muslims do start to fight back, so to speak, you know, write complaints, hold people to account for individual examples of these egregious examples that we see, then that will shake things up. And they're going to, you know, if somebody realizes they've got 5 Ofcom complaints, which they have to by law, for example, you know, launch an investigation for, if it's a TV channel, or, you know, even IPSO complaints, which they don't have any teeth, but they take up admin time and all that kind of stuff for an editor to you know, think about. Or, you know, Muslims are resisting in other areas, such as going to advertisers who advertise in certain newspapers and so forth. So when we start to fight back in these ways, somebody's going to be a bit more hesitant to, you know, write or push for a certain story in a certain spin, if they know that their feet are going to be held to the fire a bit.
Yeah, I mean, coming back to this, the IPSO guys, I mean, it is worrying because IPSO came about after on the back of the Lewisham inquiry, sort of 2011, 2012, and they replaced obviously the former. It was the Press Complaints Commission, the PCC. But of course, we've not really seen any, and the whole reason why the PPC folded was because it was doing exactly this. It wasn't taking its role seriously in preventing these types of issues. And we're seeing the IPSO doing the same thing, sort of life repeating itself, as it were. And I think one of the other things that one of the other worrying points about this is that we don't know who they consulted. So we don't know who from the Muslim community that they consulted in providing these guidance. I suppose some of the things that they've mentioned in there may give us some indication of the types of individuals that they may have involved. And for example, I remember reading one part of the guidance. It says there is no one Islam. There's no one Islam. Of course, we know there's a divergence of interpretations in Islam, but of course, you know the reason why they've done that, and that's because when they're going to be publishing a story and they're going to be using a source that's given them the most remote view about a particular issue, they'll say, oh, but hang on a second, the guidance here says that there is no one Islam, and so therefore we've not done anything wrong here. And it also says that, you know, journalists need to use a wide range of their sources, but what it doesn't say, and this is where it's irresponsible, is to say, is to interrogate that issue a bit more in terms of who are those sources, what authority do they have, how representative are their views within the Muslim community, because ultimately you're getting this person to speak about an issue about that community. So who is this individual? It could just be a complete charlatan, and as we've seen on many occasions, they bring on someone who's got no respectability or any authority within the Muslim community at all. But they're bringing this person on as an authority on Islam.
Yeah, I think the issue of consultation is key. We know who they've consulted with, you know, and those people are not representative of the Muslim community as a whole. And some of them, you know, literally, they probably wouldn't have even a handful of supporters in the Muslim community. And it really is a slap in the face of Muslims, you know, and the mainstream media are just like this as well. I remember in the early days of 5 Pillars, both myself and Dilly got invited on quite a lot to the mainstream media. And I'm pretty sure without you know, my head getting too big and his head blowing around trumpets too much, I'm pretty sure we did quite well. We held our own, but suddenly we never get invited back again. And then I thought, am I being paranoid here? You know, am I blacklisted? But I could ask the same question to many other grassroots activists in the Muslim community who will say exactly the same thing, that they're not getting invited on to programs anymore. Or if they are getting invited on, they're getting invited on where it's a setup, where ultimately there's like 2 against 1, and the debate is framed in such a way that they are there to be demonized. It's not equality of arms by any means. So ultimately, I can't prove this. In one day, inshallah, I will, with an investigative piece on 5 Pillars. But I'm sure that ultimately there is a connection between counterterrorism sources, perhaps even the Commission for Countering Extremism, the state, and big players in the media, which have a list of respectable Muslims to interview and only interview those respectable Muslims. And of course, those respectable Muslims are not grassroots activists. They are ultimately echo chambers for what the state is saying.
Yeah, I mean, you've hit the nail on the head, really. I mean, even here, this particular masjid, I mean, many of you know, of course, well documented, Imam Shakil Beg had brought a claim against Andrew Neil of the BBC in relation to a statement that he had made on national TV. And as part of that process, the complaints process, before the case went to court, it turned out, of course, that during the BBC's complaints process, that the information that they got about Imam Shakil was given to them by none other than, of course, the Quilliam Foundation. So, of course, we know that these media outlets have their list of go-to people, again, that have no respectability, of course, in the Muslim community. Yeah, I mean, it's irresponsible. I thought that the guidance from the IPSO was irresponsible with not dealing with that particular issue, because until that's done, we're going to continue to have these types of issues and these types of problems. And going back to some of the sort of double standards that we see in the media, so often you'll find, for example, when a far-right individual has committed an act of murder, an act of terrorism, whatever you want to call it, an act of crime, you will often find stories, they won't call the attack itself a terrorist act, first thing. They'll call it a murder or a suspected murder, whatever it may be. But then they'll also go on to humanize this individual. And we saw this with Joe Cox's murderer, the MP who was killed, where they were running stories about, I've got it.
He had a bad experience with his mom or whatever,
Exactly, and they do that where there's, trying to humanize, that he was a timid gardener. You might have seen that one about this individual. But we don't see, but when it comes to Muslim individuals, it's automatically associated and linked to their faith, even if it's got nothing to do with their faith, for example.
Not only that, but if somebody does show some level of understanding, like the whole beautiful young man fiasco of Muhammed Mwazi being harassed by the security services, and some Qurayshi saying he went from one thing and then allegedly turned into some becrazed killer. The very same media outlets were baying for his blood, telling, publishing lies that he was praising Mwazi and as some kind of killer and stuff. I would like to ask Roshan, what would you like to see in terms of what would have been a good result for you for the Ipsos guidance on Muslim and Islam issues? Because I'm sure you have a bit of a kind of conflict, isn't it? On the one hand, you want to reduce Islamophobia. On the other hand, you yourself, you want to have freedom to publish what you want.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a balance between freedom of speech. I mean, I think as a community, we don't mind taking part in a debate, even if that means some of the views are anti-Islam. As long as it's done in a respectful manner, then I don't think Muslims have a problem, because ultimately we're encouraged, even by our own religion, to debate and to, take on our opponents. So, for example, the Charlie Hebdo affair, for example, if Charlie Hebdo was just a newspaper that was coming up with cogent, I don't believe there are any cogent arguments against Islam, but let's, for the sake of argument, assume there is. If they were coming up with polite, cogent arguments, which maybe made the case that God didn't exist, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ wasn't a prophet, I don't think any of us would have any problems with that. But what the mainstream media does is it kind of delves into hate speech, when they're insulting our blessed prophet, when they are basically tying Muslims, associating them with terrorism, extremism, which has real life consequences. So I think that's what we want to see. We don't want to see freedom of speech being cracked down upon, because it benefits us as well. And it's necessary for us to express ourselves. And so we appreciate that. What we don't want to see is Muslims being treated like differently to any other group. So, for example, you know, anti-Semitism was rife in this country. It's been eradicated to a large extent, and now it's on the fringes. Let me take another example. You know, homosexuality or homophobia. Even when I was growing up in the 80s, it was absolutely fine to be homophobic, you know, and nobody would bat an eyelid. Now there are rules and laws against that. But Muslims have been left behind. They really have been left behind. And they're the one minority community that literally has no protection. And not only that, but it's like a free-for-all, you know, in terms of the state and the media picking on us. So I think we just want to see some equality of arms. We don't want to see freedom of speech being taken place, but we do want to see some, you know, we do ultimately want to see mainstream media journalists, who have a lot of power, you know, being educated about about Islam first and foremost, because they are incredibly ignorant about Islam, the very basics of Islam. I mean, Zilla, I don't want to have a go at you, Zilla, but you're saying that the 5 pillars was well explained. But should any mainstream journalist even be doing stories on Muslims if they don't know what the 5 pillars is? I mean, this is really basic. I remember being in a debate with the Islamophobe Douglas Murray once, and he started having a go at me about this and that and 5 pillars as extremists. And I thought, look, I'm not going to respond to him. All I'm going to do is ask him to recite Surah Al-Fatiha in Arabic. That's what I did. And of course he couldn't do it. And I said, well, if you can't do that, you don't know anything about Islam and Muslims. So what right have you even got to speak about this issue? Did he say
to you, sorry, what was that, Surah Al-Fatiha?
Yeah, he just said, oh, that's irrelevant. And I have to admit, a lot of Muslims criticized me for doing that. They felt I should have answered his questions. And I said, no, I'm not even on the same level as you. You're like down there because you don't know anything about Islam and Muslims. Even a 5-year-old child can recite Surah Al-Fatiha. Yet here you are being presented on the mainstream media as an expert on Islam. No,
good point. Just sort of picking up on the point. I know you mentioned about the sort of comparing and contrasting to, let's say, anti-Semitism, for example. You said maybe it might be on the fringe. I mean, it's still very much alive, but of course, I take your point. In terms of Islamophobia, I think Islamophobia is far more prevalent here certainly in the UK than any other sort of hates against any other faith groups, and we know that because you've actually had Muslims that have been killed here in the UK because of their beliefs. We've not had that, I don't think, in a number of years from the Sikh community or the Hindu community or the Buddhist community or the Jewish community. So of course, no one's saying that there isn't hate in respect to all those other faiths. There absolutely is, but I don't think you can say it's at the same level as it is with Islam and Muslims. I know Salman mentioned a point earlier about one of the ways he thinks that we should deal with these issues or respond is that he doesn't think that Muslims challenge the media enough. And it's probably worth bringing in your own experiences, Salman, in doing that. I mean, you've bravely and courageously taken on the government in their press statement, which concerned you, where they put up a press release, I understand it, where they sought to label you as an extremist. If you could speak to us about that, please, Salman.
Yeah, so I mean, in 2015, there was a press release, 10 Downing Street press release, when they're about to announce prevent duty guidelines for universities and higher education institutions. And in that, in just kind of like a note to editors at the bottom, they just mentioned 6 people's names. And I was one of them. I was quite surprised. It turned, so I was very fortunate to, alhamdulillah, have Bindmans, the law firm, take on the case. So we launched 2 different cases. One was a judicial review into prevent and the lawfulness of prevent and the definition of extremism and the extreme. We highlighted a lot of the inner workings of this secretive kind of Akathiyat unit within the Home Office called the Extremism Analysis Unit, which is in fact its name, by the way. And another one was a kind of defamation case, just for myself to to get an apology and damages and that kind of stuff. So what we found there was the government is not as organized and intelligent as we kind of give it credit for being. It was, I mean, we've seen emails about, you know, going back and forth between different departments and stuff, and they are it's just like a circus. It really is embarrassing how they're just kind of scrambling to get something to, you know, get a press release out, for example. And we discovered that they were getting weekly briefings from the Henry Jackson Society in this extremism analysis unit.
So why are we not surprised?
Yeah, so via this kind of shell organization called Student Rights. I had no students, by the way. But yeah, all their job is to kind of search through people's kind of social media and universities and ISOCs and stuff and mosques or whatever. And they might be watching this and just kind of compile, trying to desperately make, you know, some kind of link between any harmless thing a Muslim is talking about, and, you know, they shared a platform with this person or that person, like you said before, with the Maradona example, and they just provide kind of weekly digests and send them to the government, send them to, you know, people within the Home Office and stuff. So, and that you know, our names were just copied and pasted from one of their, you know, reports or digests, just copied and pasted verbatim. So I mean, the government has scrambled again and again to distance itself from people like the Henry Jackson Society, alhamdulillah, and partly because, you know, they keep getting sued as a result of dodgy so-called research that they provide them. The idea is, look, there are some people who are so active in, you know, putting resources to these fake think tanks, and, you know, trying their best to demonize and create links and myths where, you know, where nothing exists. But where are the Muslim kind of organizations and think tanks and media organizations and stuff that are doing this research, that are, you know, fighting back, for example? That's extremely important. And I'm not bashing Muslims or anything. We're a very young community here. Other kind of minorities have been here for, you know, up to 1,000 years or something. So we need to see what kind of the government itself. I wouldn't say it's just out to get Muslims or whatever. It's just Muslims are, like Roshan said, an easy scapegoat to distract people's attention away. Sometimes if the policy is to justify invasions and dehumanizations of Muslims abroad, then that comes back here as well. So Muslims get dehumanized here. But it's just, you know, listening to whoever's loudest. So if Muslims are Muslims shouldn't expect someone else to come to their savior and someone else to come and swoop in and, you know, make the government, make the media, make whatever, the establishment, make them be fair. No, Muslims have to get up ourselves and kind of fight back, so to speak, you know, and challenge them legally, challenge them, academically, challenge them intellectually.
So to interrupt, you mentioned about some of these organizations that are there designed to there to just find a web of sort of associations or lines, and sometimes it could be something really as stupid as, oh, Salman was likely to have visited this Tesco store, and we know that this particular individual, this named terrorist, lived in this area, and so therefore Salman could have passed by this Tesco's and met this individual, and there you go, there's an association. I mean,
yeah, the halal meat section.
Absolutely. To add a
halal Pizza Express.
They'll throw that, but it often is as ridiculous as that. Yeah. And I think the point that you mentioned there, so we've got two examples here. One was with Imam Shakil's himself here in relation to the BBC getting information from an organization. In your case, the government getting their source and information from a particular organization. And so when we as Muslims say that there's, you know, we feel that there's these things are agenda driven, that it's not happening in a vacuum. It is more than that. It's, you know, sophisticated, it's organized, it's orchestrated, that it's not us being conspiracy theorists, it's not us being paranoid. It is actually happening, that we are living in, as a Muslim community, as a fifth column, you know, it is very much a McCarthyite sort of regime or system that we're facing.
Yeah, I mean, but I wouldn't say everyone in the media or the government or whatever in the establishment.
No, of course not. Yeah.
It's because there are people with a vested interest. Roshan mentioned Douglas Murray, for example, the associate director of Henry Jackson Society. His raison d'etre is what? To make, he said it himself, to make conditions for Muslims hard across the board in Europe. And that's his aim, to have, and neoconservatives in general, to launch hot wars abroad and cold wars at home, right? This is part of the ideology and their, their modus operandi. Now, if they're going to do that hard work of compiling lists of people and regular briefings to the Home Office, to journalists, to news editors, then people are lazy. If they're gonna be spoon-fed information, they're gonna, and they see maybe there's a juicy story in there somewhere, and there's no competing narrative for them. They're just gonna take take the path of least hard work for them.
But it is worth challenging, of course. And we know a recent example with the Henry Jackson Society themselves, who were sued, and they paid out, I think it was to Huda TV or Huda. That was quite recent. I mean, again, speaking about the Henry Jackson Society here in Lewisham Islamic Centre, we had one of our Scouts leader, Ahmed Hussein. The Telegraph had written a story, an article about him. I believe it was a front page linked story. And of course, as you often find, once one of these media outlets puts out a story, it's then churned out by the others, which is why I call them journalists and not journalists. And of course, he then found that it was not only reported in the Telegraph, but it was in the Express, in the Times, in the Sun, the Daily Mail. So about 5 different publications that ran this story. And we had an individual from the Henry Jackson Society, Nikita Malik, who was involved. He was, at the time, sort of proudly put, on social media, putting up her involvement in this story and investigation. But of course, it wasn't an investigation at all. They were saying that he was being investigated by the police about his, associations with all these extremists and terrorists, and they were linking him to people like, I can't remember some of the individuals, but and they were also saying that he holds anti-Semitic views and trying to link him to a Holocaust denier and all these other things, which are all completely fabricated, all completely untrue. And, thankfully, again, he took the courageous step, much like yourself, Salman, in challenging these media outlets, and he sued all of them, and he also succeeded. And Lewisham Islamic Centre themselves also brought a complaint against all these media outlets through IPSO, and again, that was a successful outcome as well. Roshan, I know you yourself have also challenged, I think it was the Metro News, and got an apology through them. What was that about, Roshan?
Zilla, I think I've been, there've been so many kind of cases against me, or I've launched so many cases against newspapers that it all blurs one into another. It seems like at least I'm on this like at least 3 times a year. So the Metro case, I can't even remember what it was. I remember the Telegraph. I remember there was a front page of me on the Telegraph about 1.5 years ago, saying that I had secretly filmed a Labour Party meeting, and my face was emblazoned on the front page. I was never at that meeting. I wasn't there.
How did you secretly record it then?
No, I mean a colleague of mine filmed it, but it wasn't me. They completely got the story wrong, and they said I was a Labour Party member, and I've never been a member of any political party in my life. They basically got all the elements of the story wrong. And I went through IPSO, and they corrected. They didn't apologize for getting the whole thing wrong, but they corrected it. Metro, I can't remember what the Metro case was about. Ultimately, what I was saying before, Zilla, is that if you're in the limelight as a Muslim journalist, it becomes. I remember the first case that happened to me. I was quite worried about it, and I was losing sleep over it. I was over preparing, and now I just kind of take it in my stride, and I just see it as part of my work, an occupational hazard. The amount of complaints that come into Impress, our regulator, about 5 pillars. I think we're the most complained organization. And all of these complaints are completely spurious. Not one complaint. I think we've had about 20 or 30 complaints. off the top of my head. And not one of them has ever seen the light of day because they're completely spurious. They are usually, if I can say it quite frankly, they are usually from Zionist individuals or organizations who have a problem with what we write about Israel, the apartheid state of Israel. And, you know, yeah, so what can I say? I just see it as an occupational hazard now, part of my work. Ultimately, I wouldn't write anything if I felt that it wasn't accurate. And I wouldn't say anything if I felt it wasn't accurate. And if I do make a mistake, and I have made mistakes, so have 5 pillars, we will correct it because everyone makes mistakes. If we're not going to stand by something which is wrong. The metro thing might have been about, yeah, you know, I don't know, I have to look it up. I can't remember what it was about.
Okay.
Sorry,
Right.
my memory fails me.
No problem. But I think the point to take from that segment, of course, is that it is worth challenging and it does have results. And some people say that Katie Hopkins, for example, when she had a stint at the Daily Mail, that, you know, they were getting loads of claims against them, and maybe that contributed to her being moved on. They just simply
I remember, just pretty briefly, I do remember now. I think it was about anti-Semitism. So basically, the Metro, I think, called me anti-Semitic or something like that. I would just like to make it clear that I have never in my whole life said anything against Jews as a race or Judaism as a religion. As Muslims, you know, Ahl Kitab, right? You know, people of the book. We are taught to respect Jews and Judaism. What I have done is quite harshly criticize Israel as a state, as a Zionist state, because of what they've done to the Palestinians and how they've dispossessed the Palestinians. In that, I have been, you know, there are millions of people around the world, or more than that, who would agree 100% with what I'm saying, including Jews. Yet we are being targeted as anti-Semites because there is this process underway to conflate anti-Zionism, which is a political movement and a political ideology, with anti-Semitism, which is an unconscionable act of hate, which I oppose. But obviously, we've seen the Labour Party, and this is happening in the Labour Party and the wider society. It's people who want to shut down criticism of Israel are trying to shut down voices like mine because we oppose Zionism.
But the important thing is, of course, you got the apology there, so that's worth noting. And of course, just briefly touching on that, I suppose, is using the example of Maradona again. I mean, he was someone that said, I'm a Palestinian. So he supported the Palestinian cause. So thereby, I suppose people will say Maradona is now
anti-Semitic.
Or associated with some sort of extremist because of that. But moving on, do you think there's a need to have more Muslim media outlets? I mean, if we're looking at the moment here in the UK, we've got 5 pillars, of course. And we've got, you know, Islam 21C. We've got Ilfeed that does a great job in presenting, you know, positive Muslim stories. We've got Dome, again, another online platform that's there simply to capture and detail and report about stories against or issues
against Muslims,
against the Muslim community worldwide. But apart from that, I can't really think of any others. I mean, do you think there is a need for more? I know, Roshan, you've even gone as far as saying in the past that even social media outlets, you know, for example, I think there's a Muslim Facebook or something to that example, and you was trying to say we should all try to sign up to that, have our own platform. I mean, do you think there is a need for more outlets? And if so, how do we go about having those outlets? And why is it that we haven't had more? Because even 5 pillars, I don't think there's an equivalent even in America. Is that correct?
No, there isn't. I don't think we need more Muslim media outlets. I think we got quite a lot. I just think the ones that exist have to do a better job, including 5 pillars. The whole reason why we launched 5 pillars is because we felt that Muslim media wasn't effective enough, wasn't reaching wide enough audiences, wasn't really tackling the issues, and was very tame, while the Muslim community were literally being kind of, you know, people were coming at them with pitchforks, metaphorically. The Muslim media was failing to reflect that. However, I must say that when I grew up, there was no Muslim media. Growing up in the 80s and the 90s, there was zero, okay? So, you know, at least we have Islam Channel, we have British Muslim TV, we have online websites, We used to have print versions like the Muslim News and others.
Yeah.
Some of them failed, some of them went away, some of them, you know, are still around today. I just think we need to do a better job. And I think that without naming names, I think there is a lot of good work being done. And a lot of work which is reaching audiences like it has never done before. So that's the positive. The negative side of it is I think that there isn't enough independent Muslim media. You know, I think I would like to see more Muslim media that genuinely reflects the views of Muslims in this country at a grassroots level, isn't beholden to sectarian interests or state interests, etc., etc. Because you know that agenda can change. You know, if you're funded by a state, for example, their agenda can change from 1 minute to the next, as we've seen with UAE or something like that. You know, literally it can just change. So it's very dangerous, and I think we have to have self-sustaining, not just media institutions, but generally all our institutions have to be self-sustaining financially, and that requires a change in the mindset of Muslims in this country, because we are very generous when it comes to humanitarian causes, as we should be, unbelievably generous, but we're not thinking strategically enough in terms of political causes. So we won't fund media institutions. I'm not begging for money here at all or anything like that, but what I'm saying is that we should look at it strategically and think of a humanitarian cause. Yeah, it's necessary, but it's kind of a sticking plaster. Whereas a political cause with think tanks, media, political institutions, these are looking at long-term issues. So the results of that kind of work maybe won't be seen in 1 week or 1 month or 1 year, but it will be seen in 10 years and 20 years. So Muslims really need to get into that mentality of not looking at things short term, and they should be supporting our media institutions if they feel they're doing a good job, obviously, and only if they feel they're properly supporting Muslims. They should look at it in terms of support them just as much as they would support a humanitarian organization.
Salman, your thoughts?
I would say agree and disagree. I agree to obviously the need to bolster the media in general, and also news and so forth, and politics. But I think personally that it would be good to have more and more genuine grassroots voices for Muslims. I mean, we're not a news site per se, but what we do encourage is people to hone their skills and go out wherever they can in their local community, spread not just Islam, but things that are necessary for Islam to be spread, i.e. people speaking out against and dismantling oppressive kind of structures around them, speaking out against injustice, and so forth, empowering the community, giving them confidence, and so forth. And I think the way the whole where the whole kind of online environment is going, it's more kind of segmented, kind of further and further and further. So if you're a Muslim gardener who likes bikes or whatever, there's probably a group out there or something out there for you. So if you're involved in, if you have your own blog or you have your own website or whatever, where you're pushing out your ideas and thoughts and so forth, why not, have more and more people who are genuinely representing their interests in an honest way. That's why this we always push this alongside da'wah and tarbiyah, nurturing and cultivating Muslims for their being confident in their skin as Muslims, but having that understanding of their deen, their way of life, their civilizational history and paradigm, such that they can articulate their views, their place in the world, in the modern world, with confidence, fight for their rights, in the best way that's possible. And if there's 1,000 different outlets doing that, I think that all the better. As long as we have certain things that gel us together, we understand, for example, the importance of unity, the importance of cooperation, the importance of being faithful generally to the thawabit of Islam, the unchanging elements of Islam, and having that cooperation and affection amongst that wala for Muslims and Islam, basically. So if you have all of that, I'm a believer of having loads of different things around there, because ultimately people are going to have their own audiences and stuff. As Sun Tzu said in The Art of War, it's one of those, this apparent, fracturedness and different battalions or whatever doing their own thing, but internally their hearts are united. That would be an amazing thing. So, bolster the organizations that are already there. I think there's a few others like Middle East Monitor and if you like that as well. Share resources, share training and expertise and experience and stuff. And this has to be, again, alongside tarbiyah, because you can't just let someone, take the brakes off and think that they may be fighting for Islam or speaking haqq or whatever. But if they don't have that connection with their community, if they don't have that connection with providers of tarbiyah, it doesn't have to be a scholar from a particular background or whatever, but individuals can give tarbiyah to each other on the same level, that make sure they're grounded, make sure they have a good relationship with Allah, and a connection to their community and stuff. So Muslims and Islam, basically. So Muslim representation in media and news and so forth. What are Muslims thinking? 5 pillars tagline, which I'm a supporter, by the way. Pay them, pay them. Do the 5-month a subscription model all the time, alhamdulillah. But so that's very important, as well as the Islam side as well. So the actual putting Islam into making sure there's enough Islam inside Muslims. So
so I think
that the more the merrier.
Yeah, so we need a shift in our mindset, I think, as a community, because whilst we've got loads of Muslims and loads of professionals, doctors and lawyers and engineers, there is a shortage in this particular area. And, Muslims, as you mentioned, should be present in the media, as they should be in all other sectors and fields as well. And, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he recognized this. When you look at the, how he worked with his companions, the Sahaba, for example, some were more geared maybe towards battle, an armed conflict, Khalid ibn Walid, for example, and that's what he specialized in. And then you've got others that are more studious, maybe Ibn Masud, for example. You've got others that specialized in poetry, and the Prophet ﷺ encouraged him, like Hassan ibn Thabit, for example. So I think as Muslims, we've got the guidance there from the Prophet ﷺ in this, that we should try to harness particular skills within individuals and try to channel it in the right way. And I don't think we've necessarily done that
And just to interrupt, it reminds me of Sheikh Haytham is always saying that Muslims need to push their kids to study humanities, for example, because historically a lot of us, we've just been pushed to study, engineering, maths, medicine, engineering, medicine, science, accountancy. These are all rule following professions, right? They follow instructions. But sociologists, maybe even journalists, politicians, these are potentially disruptive professions that the Ummah needs as well. So I think that there has been a big shift since I was at university, for example. A lot more Muslims studying journalism and studying sociology or philosophy or politics and economics and stuff. So I think the future is bright, but they need the tarbiyah structures in place to keep their head screwed on, basically, and stay on the right track.
Salman, you mentioned the future is bright. You're not, just because you're wearing orange, I just wanted to make sure you're not trying to use orange's tagline. You're not
they don't exist anymore.
The future is bright. The future is orange. Roshan, briefly, I mean, have you thought about trying to set up some sort of, I don't know, some sort of school or some system, or put some structure in place that would help more, youngsters who want to get into journalism, Muslims, maybe, with yourself and other Muslim journalists, maybe from TRT and a number of other different channels, to see if we can set up something so it makes it more easier for Muslims to come through the process. And you've been in the game for more than 20 years, and I'm sure many others have as well. And it then allows people to, more people to get involved. I mean, I've seen so many times, I've seen, Muslims, so, really talented individuals, really bright, academically come through the system. And unfortunately, it seems to me that they get lost in the system. They want to do something. They want to do something within the Muslim space, or Islam, help Islam, the cause of Islam in some way or another. And then they sort of get lost where they're going, and they just end up in a Muslim charity. They end up with Islamic relief, or I'm not saying that work, there's anything wrong with that work, but I just think that the talents that they've got, they could have done, they could have done so much more with their skills that to some extent it's been wasted, I think, by just moving along and getting lost in their sort of career.
Most of them are headhunted by, just big corporations and finance industry and stuff. So those that actually still stay in the Muslim kind of sector, if you can call it that, are still a very small minority.
Roshan?
Yeah, we have thought about that, actually, having some kind of school of journalism or giving media training. It's all a question of time, I think, Zilor. We are overwhelmed we miss so many stories because ultimately we're still a very small team and we don't have the finances to hire lots of staff, which means that to a certain extent, I have to admit that we're firefighting, just to cover the main stories that are affecting the Ummah. And that leaves us little or no time to do anything else. So it's something strategic. Unfortunately, Muslims are perhaps not that great at cooperating with each other. Muslim organizations are talking about. This is something I think is necessary, could be done. I want to do it. I want to be part of a project that does it. I think you raise a very interesting point about volunteering. So we see Muslims volunteering for charities quite a lot. I would love them to volunteer for 5 Pillars, as long as they have they're committed and they're serious, and they have that positive attitude, and they genuinely want to kind of get involved in Muslim activism over the long term, not the short term. Then I would love people to approach 5 Pillars. I've tried to set that up with different degrees of success, but ultimately, I think I've been quite lucky, and journalism has been a meaningful career for me. It's been a meaningful life. And I think that's what people want out of their lives. They don't just want money. Of course they want money as well. And it is possible to be a journalist and to make money as well. It definitely is. You're not going to get rich, but you can still, make a decent living. It's very, very possible. It's becoming harder to do that, I must admit, but it is still very possible. And I think one reason why 5 Pillars has succeeded to a certain extent anyway is because we've championed the Muslim community. We've given them a voice. We've unashamedly championed the community, and they appreciate that. And that's why they give money to us, and that's why they're on. They give money every month to us, etc., etc. So I would say that it's something that needs to be done, Zillow, and it's in my head, and I haven't realized it as a project yet.
Okay, all right, no, brilliant. I've actually got loads of other questions here, but I am conscious of time, and we do have a number of questions here as well. I mean, one of the other things I wanted to talk about, of course, is apart from the media being Islamophobic, I also think that it's a Liverpool-dominated media as well, from a footballing sense. But Roshan, I can see you want to say something about that. But just some of the questions here I'll take. We've got a question here. Not sure how related it is necessarily to this particular topic, but it says, are we about to head into a new era of imperialism? My simple response to that would be, has that era ever ended? Really, so I don't necessarily think it's a new era, probably more just a continuation. The second question here is, if Muslim media has the power to influence or media general opinion, in what ways can it affect Islamophobia in general public? I think we've sort of covered some of that during the course of our discussion today, where we've looked at some of these headlines and the stories, and of course we know what you read forms and shapes your views and perceptions about what you feel and what you understand. What do you make of channels such as TRT, Al Jazeera, Press TV? Can they challenge the monopoly and dominance of Western media or mainstream media? Salman, your thoughts on that?
I think they can. I mean, obviously, a news channel or whatever that's, you know, based or funded by in part by a particular government or whatever, it's going to have its slant. But when it's talking about something, where you expect them to be, it doesn't affect. It's not affected by that, government's foreign policy, whatever. That's important, especially when you get them to play off each other. So if you wanna maybe look for dirt on Russia or what's happening, or some Russians are going, you can, if their enemies are gonna obviously try blow things up, metaphorically speaking, but you'll get the critical stuff there. If you want to get dirt on America, you can go, you see what the Russian, they'll find every little piece of dirt that they can find, and likewise intra kind of between different countries and stuff. So we can trust them for certain things, but we have to put a critical lens on everything that we read and hear. So just don't take everything to the bank. Don't be gullible, and take everything you read with a pinch of salt. But it is possible for them to rival the mainstream media with its own kind of obvious biases and stuff, in my opinion. Yeah.
Yes, Roshan?
Well, yeah, just going through those questions. I mean, on the imperialism thing, it hasn't ended, but I think compared to, let's say the time of the Iraq War, there is a multipolar world emerging now. So we have China and Russia kind of ganging together to oppose America to a large extent. And of course, we're not supporters of, as Muslims, we're not supporters of the Russian state or the Chinese state. They're doing some horrendous things. But I think that it is healthy to have some kind of balance in the world, because if America is the only superpower, you get things like the Iraq War. So that's the only comment I would make on that. In terms of how Muslim media can affect Islamophobia, I'm a great believer. I think one thing that I have noticed in the last 20 years is that in the 1990s, when I was a young man, and before that, we were Asians in the public imagination. Now we are Muslims. So I think one thing you can say for Muslim media and the Muslim community in general is that we have succeeded in forming that British Muslim identity over the last 20 years. And I think I don't claim that I've done much myself, but if I have a little contribution, I would say I helped do that through my journalism. And I think that British Muslims, one thing that we can be proud of is that we have stuck very tight to our religion, by and large, unlike other immigrant communities, because the trajectory of immigrant communities is that they assimilate. And you can make the case that American Muslims have assimilated to a far greater degree than British Muslims and have jettisoned their religious and political values along the way. I'm exaggerating, but I think that is true to a certain extent. Whereas British Muslims, alhamdulillah, perhaps uniquely in the Western world, have held tight to the rope of Allah in ways that other minority communities in other countries have not. So that's something to be proud of. In terms of the TRT, Al Jazeera, Press TV and other, I think the mainstream media, we have to admit that it has been decimated. Its audiences have decimated with a multi-channel world emerging, but also with the emergence of Al Jazeera and others, RT and other channels. The mainstream narrative is broken down, and that is why they're worried, Silo. That is why they're trumpeting things like fake news. I mean, the largest purveyor of fake news is not Russia, it's the mainstream media in the West. They paved the way for the Iraq War, the most egregious crime of the 21st century, and I think that ultimately they are shedding audiences, and that's why they're lashing out at others. That's why they're saying things like Russia, you basically, controls US elections, which is not true. Obviously they interfere, but it's just, they just don't have that power, and we're seeing all these narratives which are blatantly not true. And that is because the mainstream media has lost control. And because they're losing control, they are lashing out at others in an attempt to justify themselves, instead of looking in the mirror and asking themselves, why do people not trust journalists in this country? Why are opinion polls so low in terms of trust for journalists in this country? Instead of looking in the mirror and saying, it's our fault. We laid the ground for the Iraq war. We got rid of Jeremy Corbyn, you know, and amplified all these issues which led to the downfall of Jeremy Corbyn. Instead of doing that, they are saying, no, it's the alternative media's fault. It's social media's fault, etc., etc. And the last thing I would say, Zilla, is that social media, Muslims need to realize that they control our lives to a far great extent. Facebook, Twitter, all these, you know, Google, all these big multinational companies that have given us a voice over the last 10 years, admittedly, they can switch the lights off just like that. And they will start switching the lights off. They're already doing it with pro-Palestine voices. They are going to do it with any voice, because ultimately they are controlled by Western governments and to a certain extent Western intelligence agencies. And if we go too far, if we become too powerful, they're going to switch the lights off. And that's why Muslims need to think strategically about their own social media platforms going ahead.
Jazakallah khair for that. In fact, you sort of moved on to my the next questions that one of the viewers had put up, which was about the prevalence of fake news and in social media and power social media against traditional media and how that can be used. And I think, Roshan, you've given your take on that in relation to how they themselves are part of that structure and therefore they themselves are also playing a role in that as well. Salman, what's your view about the use of social media in challenging maybe sort of mainstream media?
So, you know, one of the reasons why I wrote about this in the time of when the Cambridge Analytica stuff broke, one of the reasons why there's a palpable kind of contempt from kind of people who've made it in the mainstream media world is that they've been climbing up this greasy pole, shedding all of their values, buying into these the demands of these, you know, filtration mechanisms. You know, you have to do this, you have to hate these people, you have to, you know, demonize this type of group and that type of group to get up in that ladder. So they've spent decades doing that, and now comes along anyone with a Facebook ads account, and they can just target anyone they want to you know, to the T. So there's that kind of jealousy and contempt behind that as well. So obviously that opens up so many other issues in terms of algorithmically. Most of the platforms that we are on, the choice to prioritize certain things in your news feed is done completely without any human kind of input. It's done algorithmically based on these vast psychological questionnaires that we're filling out every day, all the time, not to give you things that are true, not to give you things that are good for you in your long-term interests, but to give you things that will increase the time you spend on those platforms, to increase time spent on site. I wrote about this last week. We had a theme on Islam Trinity on social media. So everyone is now in their own kind of bubble, you know, and the social media algorithms are the kind of interior decorators painting that bubble. Max Stossel, a researcher, a filmmaker and data scientist, he did a experiment just with two of his friends. You know, he asked them a question: how many crimes do immigrants commit in Europe? Yeah, so a simple question, something with you know, purportedly a statistical answer, right? So he asked that question to two different people. What do you do when you have a question? Everyone just Googles it, right? So two of his friends had the same input and got radically different outputs from Google, right? One got left-wing, right-wing kind of a Daily Mail style or Fox News style, blowing up the number of kind of instances and focusing on a very small kind of thing and blowing that up out of statistical significance. And the other person, a bit more maybe left-wing, they got news about immigrants don't really pose you a threat and blah, 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 and kind of saying it's a minority within a minority within a minority. that commit crimes and so forth. So these two people now are living in their own bubbles. Their idea of reality itself is not crafted anymore by the editor at the Daily Mail per se, or people who had the power in the traditional kind of media / propaganda industry. But it's determined now, the bubble of our reality is determined now by machines that are getting better and better at predicting what will keep us glued to those devices, those services. And we're finding out that as a result, people are going down the route of fake news and conspiracy theories and so forth, not because they're true or they're offering something that the mainstream media isn't offering. There's plenty of fake conspiracy or whatever, but because of the way they are constructed, they keep us glued. They take us from one, down a rabbit hole, from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next, until you're in some weird territory with some pretty crazy ideas. And those are actually vastly disempowering a large number of brothers and sisters, because once you've resigned to this rabbit hole you're going down, saying there's some kind of conspiracy out of our hands, there's nothing you can do. You begin to feel like a victim. You begin to feel like, oh, it's just a ploy by the people who are running the world and blah 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 blah. Mm-hmm. So it's very dangerous. The whole fake news is changing how we view our place in the world. Is changing how we view Islam even. Right. So I wrote about this last week. How artificial intelligence is creating a new madhab, a new type of determining how we talk about Islam and Muslims ourselves, let alone what's going on in the world. So these things are a blessing because they allow us to get our message across to people without the kind of prohibitive setup costs, the barriers to entry for like a traditional newspaper. You don't need a printing press or whatever. But as a result of that, we have to recognize that we're in an economy now that thrives on competing for your bigger and bigger chunks of your attention. And the algorithms have found that truth doesn't really keep your attention as much as kind of sensationalism or fake news or conspiracy theories and stuff. So we need a way to get around that. And a big part of it is tarbiyah, and nurturing and cultivating our critical thinking skills, our iman and so forth.
Out of interest, Salman, Jazakallah khair for that. Out of interest, what is the name of that madhab? Is it Twittari?
I'm looking for.
So what was that? Some really interesting points, I suppose.
To be more precise, it's not one madhab, it's like a billion different personalized madhahib to your own kind of pre-held
it is a problem.
Psychological kind of disposition.
So I think for the benefit of our listeners, I think social media can and does have a place and role, but I think put all your eggs into one basket. I think what you set out, what Roshan himself has said, is that in itself comes with its own challenges, and its own problems as well. So it's not necessarily the solution. Another question here is about developments that are taking place not too far from us here in the UK. And I think sometimes as Muslims, and I'm a great believer in having an ummatic sort of approach to things, in terms of never forgetting about what's happening, the plight of Muslims in far places in Burma or Palestine and Afghanistan, Yemen, and so many other places. But I think sometimes we do sometimes forget those that are probably a bit more local to us. And at the moment, Muslims are suffering in Europe, in places such as Austria and France, and we've seen that in recent times. I think the question here is saying, is there a need of greater European coverage of Islamophobia? I think given what's happening there, I think it's clear that it definitely is. I mean, we've seen right across the landscape of Europe, you've got these right-wing populist governments popping up. And, you know, it's really anti-immigration, anti-Islam. And that seems to be a common theme that's sort of setting into play in all these different countries. And, you know, even talking about Brexit and everything that's been going on here in the UK itself as well. And, you know, when you think about the idea of Europe itself, I mean, it came about really as a response to Islam and Muslims. So I think we as Muslims need to also understand this, because it's not necessarily a new issue. But it would be useful to get both your thoughts on that, if any.
I mean, the only thing I would say about, I mean, I used to live in France when I was a bit younger, and yeah, I mean, the UK is a liberal paradise for Muslims compared to France. I mean, we think we've got it bad here, but yeah, they have a very aggressive system of secularism. They don't really believe in multiculturalism. They believe that you have to assimilate when you come and become a French citizen. You have to think like a French citizen, have these republican values, etc., which are very, very secular, and really relegate religion to you know, a hobby or a pastime. Whereas Britain traditionally has had a more of a multicultural attitude, where it doesn't see the hijab in a school as a threat to the state, for example. Obviously, things are changing. We're going more down the French route, but generally, you know, there are literally Muslims, niqabis, etc., or Muslims who want to wear the headscarf in public institutions, who've made hijrah to London. They've made hijrah to London, you know, because they feel that the environment for Muslims is much more permissive here in the UK. I mean, a lot of bad stuff is happening in France. Literally, they are, you know, they are not going. I mean, they've just shut down the biggest anti-Islamophobia organization in the country. That's how bad things are. They've shut down the biggest Muslim charity in the country, and both of them, I think, are going to move their headquarters to the UK. So they're just using these terrorist attacks and the whole Charlie Hebdo issue as an excuse, really. Macron, especially, very unpopular president, appealing to the right wing, you know, just stealing the clothes of the right wing so he can win re-election in a couple of years' time. When I said that we don't need more Muslim media organizations, I guess I was talking about the UK, because if you think about it, Zilla, what difference will another Muslim channel on the Sky platform really make? I don't think it'll make that much difference. I think we're reasonably well covered here, but I would just like to see the Muslim institutions that exist do a better job. But when it comes to abroad, I do see gaps. I don't see, in the French language, for example, France being well covered. And France has the biggest Muslim community in Europe, something like 6 million. Germany has a bigger Muslim community than we do here in Britain. America as well, smaller Muslim community, but more affluent, etc. Different circumstances there. More intimidated by Islamophobia. So one of my ambitions was to, when we get to that stage, was to launch a 5 pillars Français, or a 5 pillars Deutsch, or a 5 pillars USA. That's yet to come, inshallah. But that I think is a gap where, you know, Muslim media institutions can fill, definitely.
Excellent. Just don't say anything bad about the French Prime Minister or the French flag, for example, because apparently, despite having freedom of speech, you can't say anything about them. So
exactly. I mean, freedom of speech in France is a complete sham, because it's only enacted against Muslims. It's a weapon against Muslims. But you can't insult the police. You can't insult the police in France. That's a criminal offense. You can't take videos of the police anymore. Even brutality. That is a law that's passing through Parliament at the moment. So it's complete sham, and no one should believe that France is upholding freedom of speech, because it doesn't.
No. So there's a gap, there's a vacuum there. I think that maybe you should think about trying to fill, certainly. Salman, your thoughts, please.
I think, you know, policymakers have created a monster that they can't control now. For years, they've been using Muslims as a scapegoat to, you know, and pushing and exploiting ancient myths that are still in the public imagination of, you know, Muslims, the foreigners coming and replacing you, and you know, kind of lock up your women, and they can't control themselves, and so all these types of kind of ancient myths and so forth. So they did that in order to, you know, consolidate their power, in order to distract people away from their own failures in governance and so forth. And now they've created this massive rising far right movement that they have to continually pander more and more to now. And you have people like Steve Bannon kind of trotting over Europe and consolidating the kind of the playbook, you know, of creating enemy within narrative, rally the ignorant and the foolish to your camp, and you know, that's how to win an election, basically. So he did that with Le Pen. He did that in Austria. He did that in even met Boris Johnson a few days apparently before his letterbox and bank robbers kind of article, the infamous one. So yeah, I mean, we have to think, what's our long-term game here? Because I'm always saying, in terms from a kind of discourse level, we should be very careful not to wander into a dispute amongst rival non-Muslim factions and take sides, for example, but strengthen our own discourse, our own narrative, our own ability to express who we are and what we are, and articulate our place in society today, and strengthen that core identity and certainty and confidence in that, such that whatever happens, and not try to kind of, you know, piggyback with the left wing or the right wing or whoever, but kind of be working on our internal organizations, our institutions, that are able to articulate our own story rather than just be, I would say, characters in someone else's story, right? So because there's also, when we're seeing things from a Muslim perspective through our lens of Islam and Muslims, and, you know, people are out to get us, and that kind of feeling might come into it. But there's also a struggle within the white European identity now, you know, coming to grips with the trauma of Europe, the trauma of modernity, the failure of liberalism and what's going to come after it, the oppression that has now, you know, been absorbed, that was meted out against other peoples in the past, the crimes of white supremacy. People are coming to grips with what does it mean to be a white male European, for example. And these crowds are kind of, these waves are, you know, taking up so many young people that have this crisis within them. What's our message to that? This is an ideal point, I believe, to increase the da'wah, increase the awareness of Islam in public, for Muslims talking about Islam rather than Douglas Murray, the Islamic expert, you know, whatever. Muslims talking about Islam and inviting people to it. You know, it's not going to solve the problem, but there are so many young people who, you know, who have been failed by society around them, failed by policymakers. There's no sense of stability in their lives, in their thinking, in their philosophy, in their moral philosophy. They see people blowing this way and that way. They see different lobbies kind of vying for their resources and the ear of their policymakers, and they feel betrayed. They feel cheated. They don't know what to do. So, you know, they're in a very precarious place. They could be swept up in the whole increasing far right movement, Islamophobic kind of narratives, and it's easy to, you know, to feel okay about yourself if you project all of your insecurities on that immigrant who's trying to take your job or whatever. But these people, they need Islam. The world needs more and more Islam. So it's important for Muslims to, you know, have their platforms and stuff and talk about these things in these areas as well. But we need more Islam as well as just more Muslims in these areas, because Islam is the only thing that's whose values are actually increasing and strengthening over time, whereas no one else has values that they actually hold to, right? That's why this whole fiasco of British values, Republican values and so forth are on the table now, because nobody has any firm values that they're actually sticking to, and Islam has that solution for people. So we need to present and articulate more and more Islam, and set up organizations and infrastructure in various countries, our own countries, in order to do that on a proper scale.
Jazakallah. Just as you was mentioning Douglas Murray again, I thought, have you noticed how Douglas Murray and Danger Mouse have the same initials, DM? There's a number of other questions here actually, but you know, I'm also conscious of the fact that, you know, we've taken a great chunk of your time, which we're really grateful for, that you've given up your time with your families to spend with us and benefit us and our communities. So I'm not going to go for any further questions at this point, because I think there are a number of others, and there's a number of questions that I myself had. Perhaps we could do another one at another time, inshallah. But as is often the case, you know, these things you can really discuss all day, really, and still you'll have lots more to talk about. Just before we sign off, I'd always like to end on a positive note, apart from the fact, of course, that Liverpool drew today, but Roshan, if I could ask...
I know what that means.
Roshan, if I could ask that you give some words, some positivity in relation to this issue about the media, its role in Islamophobia, and some positive words for the Muslim community, inshallah.
Sometimes it's difficult to be positive, Zilla, but I mean, I think we can be constructive, and we can, in terms of what we can do ourselves, what we can control, because there's a lot of stuff outside our control that we can do nothing about. But in terms of what we can control, we can definitely build our own institutions and organizations. I'm a great believer in that, and that's where I think my work is focused on. I think that, you know, ultimately, if we take the example of the Jewish community, which is very, very discriminated, you know, earlier on last century, it built its own institutions over a long period of time, and those institutions became so proud, so strong, that ultimately they influenced the mainstream, and the mainstream couldn't ignore those institutions, and that's how the Jewish people got their voice heard in the mainstream. We need to do that, but at the same time, a red line for us is that we cannot jettison our religious or political values. That's a complete red line that we must maintain. We can't assimilate to that extent. On the other hand, that's where I think our focus should be, on building our own strong media institutions and other Islamic institutions. I think also we have to work within the mainstream. We are part and parcel of the society as equal citizens, allegedly, to everybody else. So I do. It's not for me. I never want to do it because of my experiences in the past. But I do think that Muslims should have a voice within the mainstream media, and Muslims should work within the mainstream media. But they have to be careful that they're actually representing their communities when they get into those positions, and they're not just being echo chambers for an already predetermined mainstream narrative. Otherwise, it's just tokenism, and there's no point in them being there. In terms of Muslim activists, I think that we should engage with the mainstream when they invite us onto our platforms. We should also insist that we get on certain platforms as well, and call them out if we're not getting onto those platforms. We don't do enough of that, but only if we have equality of arms, only if we're treated equally to other people. So I've seen too many times where Muslims have gone onto Newsnight or Question Time, or these very high-profile shows, a Nikki Campbell show or whatever, and it's a bear pit, and everyone else gets loads of time to speak uninterrupted, but the Muslim is interrupted constantly. They're constantly under pressure. So I don't see the point of taking part in, kind of setups, stitch-ups like that. And like Salman said as well, we need to hold the mainstream to account constantly. But I must admit that even if, Muslims follow to the letter everything that I'm saying, it's still an uphill struggle. We're still a minority, and quite a weak minority at that in this country. And it's going to take a long, long time to kind of get rid of Islamophobia, if that's ever going to happen. But ultimately, all success is from Allah, and we have to measure success in terms of not just hits and reach and how many times our articles are shared, but ultimately it comes from Allah, and you know, he is the ultimate provider of good and bad, and he will determine the outcome. All we can do is our best, you know, to make it happen according to the best of our ability, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair. Salman.
Jazakallah khair. Yeah, agree with everything Roshan said. I mean, I would say enjoy the ability, the opportunity, brothers and sisters. Enjoy the opportunity to fight the fight, Islamophobia, spread you know, truth, spread justice and mercy. This is what Allah commands us to, and this is something we should enjoy as a challenge to try and, you know, bring more fairness, more justice into the world around us, into our sphere of influence. Right? Don't feel victimized. Don't feel internally that, oh no, I'm depressed or whatever. No, take it as a great opportunity to come close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Like the Sahaba, they went through far more oppression than we did, but the Prophet ﷺ, you know, he gave them a victorious future narrative. You know that this thing will prevail. You know, you don't be hasty. There are people who went through worse than you that didn't complain like this, right? So take it as an opportunity. What do we do? Subscribe to Islam 360 and read the articles and stuff there, as well as 5 pillars. You know, read the articles that particularly about your tarbiyah. Make sure everyone who's watching has a process, has a program of tarbiyah, of nurturing and development, personal development. It doesn't have to be with us, can be in anyone. It doesn't have to be with a scholar or anything like that, but a program. Sabil is one example that we encourage people to work with. Muslims are very good at learning and acquiring knowledge. That's not what tarbiyah is about. Tarbiyah includes knowledge, but someone is monitoring, someone is there for you to, you know, grow with spiritually. So, you know, make sure you're improving year on year, you know, the amount of Quran that you know, the amount of extra worship that you do, the amount of dhikr that you do, sadaqah that you give, and so forth. Just personally, you know, somebody who is you're on a journey of increasing your tarbiyah and your personal development. At the same time, so once you're doing that, there's 4 areas you can focus on that we encourage people, Muslims in as minorities, to focus on if they have an interest in these areas. Number 1, media, not in no particular order: media, politics, law, and finance/business. You know, we need Muslims in these 4 areas in particular to, you know, with at the same time as having tarbiyah and being involved in da'wah and strengthening your iman and your identity and stuff and your character. In these 4 areas in particular, we need more and more Muslims to lead and to excel in, inshallah. So, yeah, just enjoy the struggle.
Jazakallah khair to both of you again. Thank you to both of you for being with us and for being generous with your time. That does draw us to a close. As to summarize today, we've seen, of course, that Islamophobia is prevalent and rampant within the media, that it has an impact on the way people perceive and view Muslims, and this is an issue in terms of solutions. We've heard today from both our guests that we need more Muslim representation in the media, not necessarily to have more media outlets, but more people involved, and to the ones that we do currently have to better support them and to make sure that they run better. We've also seen that, you know, it was mentioned that in terms of we as Muslims, that we appreciate, we understand about the right to freedom of speech, the right for the media to be able to present ideas or criticize Islam ideas. We have no issues about having a debate or a battle of ideas, but what we often find that the media do is that they're tackling the person and not the ball, as it were. So the issue isn't that we don't have, that we're unable to articulate Islam, or that we're afraid of having this discussion or debate of ideas, but it seems that the media are. We've also seen that, you know, the rise of sort of fake news, the use of social media, and whilst it does have its benefits in challenging mainstream media and its news, it does have its own problems. Someone gave us some of the concerns about the algorithms that are used, echo chambers, and so on. And of course, in terms of positivity, I think we've seen that we need to continue doing what we're doing. You know, the results are ultimately from Allah. That, you know, this issue of Islamophobia, it's nothing new. I mean, if we look at the seerah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we understand the first Islamophobes were individuals such as Abu Jahl and Abu Lahab and these types of individuals. They would often plot and plan in places, in structures, the system there, the Darul Nadwa, where they would gather, they plot, plan, you know, strategies of how to attack the Muslims. So it's nothing new. So we should see it. You know, if the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Sahaba themselves were challenged through this struggle, then we ourselves are going to be tested by this. We need to respond equally as well. And just to end, to say, although, you know, many people say, how can we challenge this dominant media that's there? But, you know, as Allah oft reminds us in the Quran that, you know, although they plot and plan, Allah also plots and plans, and Allah is indeed the best of planners. Jazakallahu khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.